TCDSB. And Elliott Young is our honored guest speaker. Elliott is Nuhea from Ermineskin Cree Nation, located in Maskwacis, Alberta. Elliott is the acting manager, Indigenous Student Services, and Link Indigenous Education Coordinator at Norquest College. He has a BA in Native Studies from the University of Alberta and is currently finishing an MA in Community Engagement at the University of Alberta. So please welcome Elliott. It is our great honor to have you here tonight, Elliott.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for welcoming me. I'm just going to go straight into it. And you did get a bit of an introduction to myself, and I'm trying to structure this presentation in the same way that I usually present to Link students, and to give you an idea of what I do before this. Before I even introduce myself, I do a land acknowledgement, and similar to Kayla, I try to make it personable, but also I usually share a video of the different land acknowledgements that there are across Canada, because when I do it, I want to ensure that they know that there's many Indigenous people across Canada that they don't think, especially with Edmonton, we tend to be Cree-centric and really show Cree people in Edmonton. I want people, the Link students, to know that there's more Indigenous people than just Cree people here. But yeah, I usually do that, and then I go into my introduction piece, and then I take even longer with my introduction. So I'm going to share that with you, and I'll tell you why I do that. But yeah, as it was shared, I am the acting manager for Indigenous Student Services at Norquest College. I'm also the Link Indigenous Education Coordinator, and I've been working with Link since May last year. Yeah, it's been amazing. To tell you a bit more about myself, I am Cree. I'm Nehiel. I'm a member of Ermineskin Cree Nation, which is one of the 4 communities that make up, or one of the 4 First Nations that make up a community called Maskwacis. Born and raised there. My dad is from Ermineskin Cree Nation, and that's why I'm a member of Ermineskin Cree Nation. And my dad's family comes from Maskwacis, but also from Northeast Alberta. My great Gokom, my great grandmother, is from that area, and I'll tell you how I know that. And then my mom is actually from a First Nation that's located just about 2 hours south of Maskwacis, which is Sutana Nation, which is this one right here. You also use a laser pointer right there. So Sutana Nation is a Dene First Nation. Is a Dene Nation. It's their Dene. I didn't realize that until about a couple of years ago, that my mom was a totally different culture. Like I grew up Cree. A lot of my family is from Louisville, which is right beside Ermineskin Cree Nation, and they're Cree as well. But the reason why a lot of my family grew up there is because my grandmother, or my Gokom on my mom's side, married into the Louisville tribe. So a lot of my family is from there. So I grew up thinking my whole family is Cree, and there's a whole other half of me, my mom, that is actually Dene. So I just recently came into knowing that a few years ago, and I'm still exploring that quite a bit. I've been living in Edmonton for 15 years. It's where I came to school. It's where I got my BA in Native Studies, and it's where I started my career, where my career currently is, and it's where my wife and I have our home, and it's where we started our family. I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, and a little dog named Toby. Yeah, and as shared, I'm currently finishing my master's degree in community engagement, and I've been working with Norquest College for the past 2.5 years. And previously, I worked for a nonprofit organization called Homer Trust Edmonton, and I worked for about 6 years for the provincial government, the Alberta government, through Indigenous Relations, Children's Services, and the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. And the reason why I'm sharing so much about myself and about my family is because the work that I do in the government, but also in that nonprofit work, and also with my work today with Norquest College, I meet new Indigenous people and new Indigenous communities through engagement, and I always get the same question. They ask me, where am I from? And the way that I answer that is I talk about my family, so my parents, my grandparents, who they are, where they're from, and then I talk about the communities and the land that I'm talking to, or that I'm connected to. So exactly the same way that I just did through this way, I share that. And the reason why is they want to know how we're related and if we're related. And that's how I found out that my great Gokom is actually from northeast Alberta in kind of the Saddle Lake area, because my great Gokom is from that area. And when I talk about my great Gokom, they're like, oh, we're related, because we're like, and then we end up figuring out that we're like distant cousins. But it's really about that piece around being able to find your relations and be comfortable with placing yourself and be comfortable with talking about your family and where you come from. Because when I share this with newcomers, I share that when they meet Indigenous people, ask them where they're from and encourage them to talk about their family and their community and their land. And also, likewise, feel comfortable with sharing who they are, with about who their family is, where they come from, the land and the communities that they come from. And so that way you're starting that relationship off in a good way. And that's placing yourself. And that's what I like to share with students. Okay, so enough about me. I'm going to talk about the reason why we're here today. I'm going to talk about the Indian Act and some of the important legislation and laws before the Indian Act. I'm going to talk about residential schools, what happened with their resident schools, and why it's led to intergenerational trauma. And then I'm going to talk about Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then end with reconciliation. And I noticed that I still have National Orange Shirt Day in there. I'm not going to be talking about that. Bonnie will talk a little bit about that in the next slide with some of the resources around National Orange Shirt Day. Go ahead, next slide, in the next presentation. So just in time, I'm just going to jump right into it. So before the Indian Act of 1876, where I'll start is probably about 100 years before. The Royal Proclamation of 1763. That is when the Queen, in the Royal Proclamation, stated that the British need to establish treaties with the First Nations people here in Canada. Well, before Canada was Canada. And in order to settle in this land, they needed to establish treaties with First Nations people because we had title to the land here. That was recognized in the Royal Proclamation. And so in Ontario and Quebec, you'll hear about treaties being signed, and the historic treaties. And many of those treaties were signed before Canada became a country. And so those are the historic treaties. That led up to about 100 years later in 1867, when the British North America Act was signed. And that's the act that made Canada, Canada. That's how Canada has become a country. And in that BNEA Act, the British North America Act, there's a section in there that gives the responsibility of First Nations people, or Indians in the BNEA, the responsibility of Indians to the federal government, to Canada. Before this, especially from the Royal Proclamation, that recognized that the British had to get into negotiations to sign a treaty, and a treaty is an agreement between two nations, so two sovereign nations. This relationship and this perspective of building that relationship and building a treaty shifted when the BNEA Act was signed and when it was enacted, because it shifted that relationship to one person have power and the other one being seen as a ward of the state. And so the Canadian government, through the BNEA Act, gave themselves the authority to have all full power over First Nations people by stating that First Nations people are wards of the state. And to think about other wards of the state today, it's when children go into care, they become wards of the state. And so the government becomes their guardian, and then the government makes decisions on their behalf. That is what the Canadian government did to First Nations people, all First Nations people, in 1867 with the British North America Act. So it shifted that relationship from a nation to nation to one of being authoritarian, really. Fast forward 9 years later, the federal government wrote and established and enacted the Indian Act, the only race-based legislation in the world. And in the BNEA Act, it states that the responsibility of Indians fall under the federal government, but it didn't say how. And it didn't say how that responsibility was to be enacted. The Indian Act gave those details. It gave how the federal government was responsible for the First Nations people. And it described everything. It described everything that fell within a First Nations right, First Nations life. And it really restricted what First Nations people were able to do. It led to the development of reserves. So when the Indian Act was signed, and it started happening when the BNEA Act, but it solidified in the Indian Act that First Nations were going to be given plots of land, and they were to stay on those on those reserves. And they would enact that by the Indian Act. They would enforce them staying on those reserves by the Indian Act. So the Indian Act led to reserves and made First Nations people wards of the state. And it restricted what First Nations people were able to do, meaning that the Indian Act was enforced by a public servant, which is at the time was called an Indian agent. And this Indian agent would make decisions on reserve, like what decisions were happening on reserve. And they would also determine who was able to leave the reserve to do whatever they needed to do off reserve. And it was called a pass. So the way that they would allow the First Nations to leave a reserve was a pass. And it was just a little piece of paper that was called a pass. And this was the pass system. And so they would give that pass to a First Nations person that would state when they were allowed to leave and when they were expected back. And if they weren't back at that specified time, they were charged with a crime and thrown into jail. And that was the same if somebody left without a pass, they were charged and thrown into jail. So the federal government saw this as something that was not going to be sustainable. Having this type of responsibility over a group of people was not going to be sustainable. They had to have a situation that led to First Nations people no longer being wards of the state. So how was that going to be done? It was going to be done through residential schools. In the words of the Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, residential schools were to be used to kill the Indian and the child. So it was meant to separate First Nations children from their community, from their culture, from their language, and from their identity. And how would they do this? They would take children from their families, from their communities, and force, and when I say take, they took them. They took them from their families because these schools were funded by the government, funded by the federal government, and they were operated by the church. And so there would be a church representative, usually a nun or a priest, that would go to a community or go to a First Nations community, and they would be accompanied by a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer. So the police would be with them. And so they would go door to door picking up children. And if the parents said no, if they resisted the police officer and the school official if they said no to them taking their children, it was against the law. It was against the law for them to say no and to resist them taking their children. So if they resisted it, they were threatened with being charged with the crime and thrown into jail. And the ones that did resist were thrown into jail. So it was illegal for parents to say no. So they took these children and they would send them to schools that were located hundreds of kilometers away. And at this time, because residential schools started around 1876 and they didn't end until 1996. So in 1876, hundreds of kilometers away was a long journey It was either walking, or it was on horse, or it was on carriage. So it was a long travel. And so they would send these children to schools that were hundreds of kilometers away. And they would be away from their family, they would be away from their communities. And at these schools, they were not allowed to speak their language, and they were not allowed to practice their culture. And they weren't allowed to see their brothers and sisters. So boys and girls were separated, and they weren't allowed to speak with their brothers or their sisters. And then when they arrived at these schools, they had their hair cut and their clothes taken away and put into uniforms, and they were given numbers. They weren't allowed to speak their names. They weren't allowed to be recognized by their names. They were given numbers, and they were referred to by their numbers. So this was taking away their culture, taking away their language, taking away their family and community, but taking away their identity, even to the point that they weren't referred to by their name. So they were taking away a lot of what made them First Nation. And so through this school, there were stories of mental abuse, of physical abuse, of emotional abuse. And then later, when these students became adults and were challenged with intergenerational trauma, they then speaking out about the sexual abuse that they received by priests, by teachers, by nuns. There was horrendous trauma and that was felt by Indigenous students there. And there was also tragedy that happened at these schools, that many students would actually pass away while at these schools. One, by either illness. So a lot of these schools did not have proper medical services. They were usually overcrowded. So when there was an illness that came through, like tuberculosis, TB, children would succumb to their illness and they would pass away. Other ways would happen is that children would try to run away and run back home and try to make it back home. Some students didn't make it. They would die either due to the weather or due to starvation on their way back. And this is can be seen by a story shared by late Gord Downey. He has a whole series, a whole project around the story of Cheney Wenjack, who is a student that ran away from residential schools but ended up dying on the way home. And when children died at these schools, the parents were not notified. They weren't notified. They weren't sent a letter. Nobody came to their house and said that their children passed away. They would find out when the other students came home during the summer and their children didn't. And they would ask the children what happened to their kids. And they say that they passed away. The other side of it, so that's the student experience. The other side of it is the community experience and the trauma that happened when students were taken away, when children were taken away from their families. The story that was shared to me that made the biggest impact to me of understanding this is, if you think about the community you're in, the neighborhood that you're in, imagine that all the children were taken away. Imagine that you didn't hear the laughter from kids. Imagine if you didn't hear kids playing. Imagine if you didn't hear kids crying. What that would do to a community, what that would do to families, what that would do to parents. So that was the story of it, where survivors were talking about being in communities that had 0 to little children and what that did to the communities. And so all of this trauma, all of this tragedy, all of this led to something that's called intergenerational trauma. And I'm going to share a video right now that was developed by Australia, because Canada is not the only colonized state that experienced residential schools. Australia experience residential schools as well. And they're experiencing intergenerational trauma right now. And they developed an amazing video, which I'm going to share right now, that talks about intergenerational trauma.
The story of our communities, people and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other with strong minds and hearts because they were where they belonged. But then everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity. The very things that tell us who we are and where we belong. And our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the stolen generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonization and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit healingfoundation.org.
So yeah, there's one thing that I want to follow up on that with that video, in that obviously residential schools failed, but because Indigenous people are still here, First Nations people are still here, but it left a devastating impact, which is intergenerational trauma. But now there's a shift, and there's kind of a changing of terminology, changing of the perspective from that being kind of intergenerational resistance and moving towards positive intergenerational change. And so that's the exciting part of this work, is moving towards that intergenerational change. Let me see here. There we go. That's fine. Okay. So this work has all led to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation was led by three commissioners, two of them actually residential school survivors themselves. If you had the opportunity to hear Dr. Chief Wilton Littlechild, he talks about his experience of going to residential schools and that he was actually referred to his number and would consistently be referred to as by his number. They did a listening tour all across Canada, going to the different communities that had residential schools in these communities. And they listened to survivors, family members of survivors, and they read documents from these schools in the archives. The reason why they listened to family members too is that because many of these students have either passed away or either they committed suicide, they took their own life, and all of that kind of as a consequence of intergenerational trauma. So the family members would then talk about their family members, either it being a brother or a sister, a child, a parent. They would talk about their experience. And so that started in 2011. It ended around 2014 with the last listening event happening in Edmonton, which was absolutely amazing. It was such an amazing event and one to be able to witness. And then the calls to action came out in 2015. And these calls to action apply to many different sectors, that being health, education, justice, media, sports, and more. And obviously the LINK program and the sessions that I provide at Northwest College align with these calls to action. It's the reason why we're moving towards reconciliation at Northwest College. It's the reason why we're prioritizing talking about the truth of what has happened in Canada, that being colonization, that means acts of assimilation, that means residential schools and the impact that it has on the current generation through intergenerational trauma. So all of this, truth and reconciliation, the calls to action, and the reason why, there is a reason why they call it the calls to action. They didn't want to call them recommendations. They didn't want to call them anything else. They wanted to call them calls to action because they wanted action. They wanted something coming out of this. And so all of that is moving towards what we now see today as reconciliation. So over the past 5 years, 6 years now, it is 6 years now, and reconciliation has been a focus for addressing problems caused by colonization. It's a priority for Northwest College. It is a bit of a controversial statement when you do speak with Indigenous communities about this. You'll see that there's members that will talk about reconciliation as being a long-term commitment, that it took 100 years for over 100 years for residential schools to end. It's going to take us 100 years to come out of it. And then you'll meet other Indigenous community members talking about, we need more action. We need more action now. Like, reconciliation is not moving fast enough. Some will call reconciliation dead. They believe that reconciliation is dead already because not enough has been moving forward. And reasons why. And well, actually, I'm going to show this video. I'm going to show this video right now, and it goes through why some people think reconciliation is dead, and the reconciliation goes beyond certain kind of actions that are seen today. So I'm going to share this now.
Reconciliation anyway. There's a number of things that are not reconciliation. Hiring more Indigenous peoples is not reconciliation. Having more artwork in offices is not reconciliation. We should already be doing these things.
Before how I can help comes as a question, I think they first need to understand.
All you need is access to Google, and you'll be able to get onto the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's website and read the report. And even if you don't want to read it, you can read it in YouTube videos. Have it read to you.
And then not just know the truth, but there's the justice part where you actually address and make amends for everything that's happened and is still happening.
The reality is that First Nations kids are still getting between 20 to 50% less funding across every public service.
So until there's no more murdered and missing Indigenous women or are people over-incarcerated in prison, how can we skip forward to the fun reconciliation part of things?
There is no federal plan to eliminate those inequalities. And some people say, well, you know, there must be a reason for this. But let's take boil water advisories. The government of Canada can get a DART team in the air, fly them to an earthquake zone halfway around the world to get clean water pumping in 24 hours. So why can't they do that for First Nations communities in Canada? We're making choices to allow the racial discrimination to continue. And that's what we need to stop.
We will never get to real truth, justice, and reconciliation until there is a substantial transfer of power, wealth, and resources. And that means lands have to come back. That also means there has to be us sharing in the resources. And it also means a recognition and full implementation of our sovereign right to be self-determining.
When you think about the greatest human rights abuses that were done in Canada, the Chinese head tax, the internment of Japanese Canadians, and residential school, they all have two things in common. First, they were all perpetrated by the Canadian government. And second, we all let it happen because we couldn't watch the injustice and speak up and do something about it. Reconciliation is our chance to learn how to not turn away.
If I help these people in professional positions or positions of power understand what it is Indigenous people have been going through and have gone through, it's going to help my children in school right now. It's going to help their children, and it's going to help, 7 generations.
That's why I never talk about reconciliation without talking about truth, justice, and reconciliation. You won't get that from hanging artwork in an office.
Help TVO create.
All right. So my next slide is just saying thank you and asking for questions. But that really wraps it up on how to move reconciliation forward, learning about the truth, learning about colonization, learning about that switch in the relationship from nation to nation to one of power and authority, one to assimilation, colonization, residential schools, the impact of intergenerational trauma. Now the movement in the past, because the apology from the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, happened in 2008. So this work and where we are today is only 13 years old in the sense of that apology, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the work with reconciliation. It's only 13 years old, 6 years of reconciliation, knowing that there's still a lot of work to be done, and the work that you're doing, and that a lot of link programs and in Edmonton, what they're doing is moving towards reconciliation and sharing the truth and understanding how newcomers can learn about the truth and think about reconciliation in a different way. But yeah, thank you so much for listening to me, and I'd like to open it up for questions if anybody has any.